Dead. Sorry. Anyway, I'll get this. Joys and concerns, anyone?
Well, I watched Meet the Press for the very first time in my life this morning. Then on my way here, totally Carborough was the on a fence on North Greensboro Street is a excuse me a Ukrainian flag painted on the fence. So hang in there.
Anyone else? Oh, sorry.
Going along with Amy's observations, of course, the concern is what is happening in Ukraine. The AEU has put out a statement, obviously opposing the actions there, and it's based upon some of the recent resolutions that the AEU passed, and including a development of the culture of peace, which comes out of the UN, and also based upon our tenets of belief in democracy and nonviolence and other things like that. So hopefully we can have that promulgated around and get a little national attention for it. But if you can do anything to help that happen, it would be appreciated. You should have gotten a copy of it just through emails of announcement from the AEU. Thank you.
Any other joys and concerns here?
I don't know if you ever have had alpaca chicken, but tomorrow it's opening across the street.
What is?
Alpaca Peruvian chicken.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's the best chicken we've ever eaten.
Anyone? Any other joys and concerns? All right. Now, we will have the opening words from Chris.
All right, thank you for your patience. Today I want to reflect for a few minutes on the book Zero-Sum Hierarchy, about zero-sum hierarchy, from the book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Zero-sum thinking is the idea that letting someone else have more means that you will have less, that there is not enough to share without losing what little we may have, or without sacrificing how much we may have. Such thinking seemed to be growing during the Obama administration, resulting in the growth of the Tea Party, the birth and growth of the Tea Party, particularly among whites. McGhee cites the work of two Harvard professors, one of business and one of psychology, who studied this movement and found that whites who participated in their survey believed that anti-white bias was worse than anti-black bias. Such bias has been accelerating since the 1970s, according to the authors. The professors concluded that the average white person views racism as a zero-sum game. If things are getting better for Black people, it must be at the expense of white people. McGee decided that she had to find out why this was the case. So why do I mention this today? Well, our speaker today is going to talk about his work advocating for policies to treat people more fairly and equitably, with a focus on the Chapel Hill community. I doubt many of us would subscribe to this zero-sum thinking, but understanding how such thinking works and influences policies and practices in any community is a worthwhile effort. We may even find that such thinking undergirds some of our own thinking, such as spending and taxation. It reminds me of a term that used to be popular called socially liberal and fiscally conservative. Yes.
Your microphone is breaking up. It's hard to.
Hmm.
The audio is in and out.
Not sure. I'll try. Yeah, I hear it going in and out. Not. Maybe I should just step away from it and talk out. Is that better? Okay. So when I think during the Clinton years, the term socially liberal and fiscally conservative was used often. So my question to you is, does the former fiscally conservative interfere with does the latter, which is fiscal conservative, interfere with the former, which is socially liberal? I don't expect our speaker to answer this question today, but I am asking it of you and encourage you to read this book by Heather McGee. The book does end on an encouraging note, a prescription for what may work in our battle for a more fair and equitable society, and what our founder, Felix Adler, termed ethical culture. Thank you. The book is The Sum of Us by Heather McGee. Oh.
Thanks, Chris. Chris's mention of fiscally conservative and socially liberal actually I recall there was a cartoon about it in the New Yorker many, many years ago when this term first came out. This cartoon showed two young women talking about a mutual acquaintance, and one of them says that she's a fiscally conservative and socially liberal, and the other one says, well, it just means he's cheap and sleeps around. So anyway, today's program is by Mr. Alan Buansi. Did I get your name right? Okay. And on what the times demand of us and our legislature. John, can you please introduce the speaker?
They will all get used to our microphones here. Education, environment, justice, and land use law. in 2017, and he served until the end of his term in December of 2021. So in the NC House. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Well, anyway, so we'll be hearing from Alan today on what the times demand of us in our legislature. And I know we're all very interested in hearing what he has to say. So Alan, it's all yours.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Blue lights on? Yep. it
Yep.
is. Good.
All good. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So good afternoon. Oh, let me take the mask off so you can hear me clearly. Good afternoon. All right. I hope we can get a bit more lively as we go along. Good afternoon. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I feed off of y'all's energy, so I appreciate y'all indulging me. Thank you all for having me here today. John, thank you so much for the gracious introduction. I don't know if y'all know my mother, Kim Allen, Dr. Kim Allen. She's come to meetings before, but she has told me wonderful things about this space, about the people that she's met. And I'm so grateful to be in your company because my mother, when it comes to grading folks, she's got a pretty high bar. So, and so I do want to start off by just telling you all a bit about myself. I know John gave a bit of an intro, but also want to reorient us in a way where you can understand where I'm coming from, why I do the work that I do. So back in this is 1998. My mother moved us down to Chapel Hill. She had gotten into the PhD program at UNC in the Department of Cultural Anthropology, and she studied there for some years under someone named Dr. Dottie Holland, who was the chair of the Department of Anthropology at the time, and was much more than that. She became like a second mother to me. She welcomed us with open arms. She would even march down to the school with us when we had problems with the school system. And our problems started pretty early on. I can remember probably the second day that I was at school, the principal at the time had challenged the residency of my mother and me. Apparently there had been issues with folks attending the school who didn't live in the school districts. There were folks coming in from Durham. And so the principal, for some reason, suspected that I did not live in Chapel Hill. And I don't know why. Yeah, I don't know why. But regardless, that was one of the first encounters, not one of my first encounters with racism, because I'd certainly encountered it before, but it was one of my first encounters with something called coded racism or institutional racism. And I can remember my mother heard about the principal's concern. She was livid. And she took it upon herself, of course, to march right on down to the principal's office and to tell this person why he should not challenge that, why he needs to take our word for granted, and why what he was doing was the stuff of racism. And I remember Ms. Dottie also walked down there with her. And that was important for me to see, because for folks that don't know Ms. Dottie, she's an older white woman. She's someone who didn't need to do that. She didn't have to do that. But she saw something that was wrong, and she responded to the moment. She responded to my mother calling for her help, and she took it on as if it were her own personal problem. And so seeing that very early on in my time in Chapel Hill was inspiring. I remember at the time I was confused, but seeing the clarity in which they acted sparked something in me. And I remember in the following summer, this was the summer of my 7th grade year, so I think 99, my mother did one of the best things she could have ever done for me. She saw me lounging around the house. She saw me playing video games and, lounging around, and she said, Alan, you need to stop that. Pick this book up and read it. It was a book about Justice Thurgood Marshall. And when I finished that, she put another book into my hands about someone named Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. And these were folks who, at a time when things were pretty bleak, pretty dark for Black folks, for people of color, for women, they stepped up, and they had a very clear vision for equality and equity in our country. And they dedicated their lives to that mission. And while they didn't see their vision come to fruition, they did their best to move the ball forward. And so it was about that time that I actually developed this notion, and I'll move to the next slide here. I developed this notion of being a civil rights lawyer. I mean, seeing or reading about Thurgood Marshall and the structures that he took on, his voyages and really bravery, going from place to place, especially in the South, that inspired me. And so I developed this notion of wanting to be a civil rights lawyer because I wanted to do what he did. I wanted to help people who did not have voices. I wanted to help people who, even though they didn't have voices, they knew what they were facing was wrong. And so I wanted to be in a position to try to help empower people to advocate for themselves and to make change. And so then from there, fast forward to high school, when I was at East Chapel High School, I don't know if you all know the name Jack Boger. He is a former dean of the law school. And at the time, back in the early 2000s, he was actually the deputy director of the UNC Center for Civil Rights. And he came to our school to talk about a case that was going on at that time called Leandro. And I don't know how many folks are familiar with Leandro, but Leandro is a state Supreme Court case in which the court essentially recognized this constitutional right of every child to a sound basic education. It's a vague term, vague phrase, but essentially what it comes down to is that the state has a responsibility to make sure that every child has adequate schools, that they have quality teachers, and that they have quality principals so that they can grow into the people that they want to be, so that they can be supported in the kind of work that they want to do. And it's a 20 plus years old case that we have really been struggling in North Carolina to match, to meet, especially over the past decade plus. But I remember when Jack told us about that case, that further inspired me. Seeing him in action, seeing and hearing about other lawyers in action advocating for children in need, that just reaffirmed to me that that's the kind of work I was meant to do. And so, let's see, I want to make sure I cover all the bases, but I remember later on in my high school career, this was back in 2004. I don't know how many of y'all remember that election. This was the presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And I remember that fall, I was thinking about, what can I do to help? Because, by that point, I was paying attention to politics. I was paying attention to what was going on, especially with the war in Iraq. And I thought, what can I do? And so I told my mom, and my mom said, even though you can't vote right now, what you can do is help other people vote. And so I remember I partnered with my guidance counselor, Jessica Harris at East Chapel High School. And we went out, set up a booth, and registered people in front of Walmart over at New Hope Commons. And actually, I found out too that I was able to vote. There's a law that has since been repealed, but there was a law at the time that allowed a 17-year-old to actually register to vote as long as their birthday fell on November 2nd or at some point before then. And so my birthday happened to fall right there on election day, November 2nd, 2004. And so I was proud to register and to submit my ballot. No secrets about it, I voted for John Kerry. So, and so, after that point, I go on to Dartmouth College, and I remember one of Ms. Dottie's main concerns about me going to Dartmouth College was that it was a very conservative, had a very conservative culture to it. A lot of publications like the American Spectator had come out of Dartmouth College, and she was concerned that if I went there, that I would then be converted into that ideology. And I pushed back on that. I said, Ms. Dottie, listen, I've grown up in Chapel Hill. I have hardly met anyone who I'd call a conservative. And it would really do me some good to be in touch and engaging with, talking to folks who think differently than I do. And she said, no, you can do that. You can do that. Just, you can go over to Alamance County. You don't need to go up north. And so, but in response, I said, no, Ms. Dottie, I want to do this. And so I went on to Dartmouth College, and I definitely got that experience of meeting folks who thought differently than me and then some. I remember one of the first conversations I'd had was with someone who lived across the hall from me. I remember Mitt Coates. He was a US Olympian skier from Utah, Mormon. And I remember we were having a conversation about video games, and somehow we got onto the subject of politics. And I remember he said something like, yeah, I'm glad that the lesser of two evils won in 2004. And and I was like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And he went on to say, well, W aligns with me, religiously speaking, definitely with regards to abortion, definitely when it comes to values about businesses, promoting businesses. And so, I mean, he and I got into a heated argument, but I do remember at some point, I remembered some of the words that Ms. Dottie and my mom, essentially from their anthropological backgrounds, said to me. They talked about the importance of listening. They talked to me about the importance of trying to understand where someone else is coming from. And so I kind of changed my line of questioning, and I, asked him about his background. I asked him about, where he grew up exactly. He said Utah. I asked him about his religion, Mormonism. I hadn't known much about that religion at the time, and I got to know that a bit more. And I also asked him about his encounters or his past experiences meeting with people of color. And he hadn't had many of those. And so, at some point in the conversation, it kind of clicked for me where I thought, wow, if I had his background, if I'd grown up the way he'd grown up, I mean, I might think the same way too. And so that was illuminating. I also walked onto the football team at Dartmouth during my second year, my sophomore year. And that experience was also illuminating because a lot of players on the team, very conservative. I can remember one teammate in particular, there's an old mascot of Dartmouth called the Dartmouth Indian, which had, for decades been taken off, but he still had this mascot, this huge mascot in his dorm room. He was like, yeah, this is the real mascot right here, man. But I remember having a lot of conversations in that locker room with folks who, had a much different upbringing than I did. And the takeaway that I got from that experience at Dartmouth was that, of course, there are folks that think differently than me, but I'm always going to do my best to reach out, and I'm always going to do my best to meet them wherever they are so that we can build on something, so that we can find some common ground, and we can, whether by inches or by yards or by fields, move the ball forward. And so, fast forward on to law school. Again, y'all know about my dream of being a civil rights lawyer. I got to see that through law school. I got to see that through after law school when I worked at the Center for Civil Rights. I did have a brief stint, or maybe a year-long plus stint, working for Josh Stein for Attorney General, where I got to take the lessons I'd learned at the center and put it into that work, especially when it came to the treatment of drugs and of drug felony offenses. I actually got to work on the STOP Act, which was part of a reorientation of law enforcement towards opioids. It was one of the first times in North Carolina's history where it stopped treating drugs and people who use drugs as criminals and treated them instead as people who need help, who need resources, who don't need bars or handcuffs, but instead need rehabilitation centers and naloxone, a substance that's used to reverse drug overdoses, especially of prescription opioids. And so that was important work. I went back to the Center for Civil Rights and spent another 4 years there until just last year, where I ended as the deputy director at the Center for Civil Rights. But now I find myself as an assistant city attorney in Greensboro. And while the work itself, you might not say it's civil rights work, I would argue that it is, because one thing that work at the center revealed to me is that Jim Crow is everywhere. It is in our streets, it's in our buildings, it's in our homes. The way that this town is set up, the way that towns across North Carolina are set up, they're all imbued with Jim Crow still. And when we adopt these processes that we've had for so long, when we kind of do things the way we've always done them, we tend to ignore the roots of these systems. And certainly one thing that I found in civil rights is that through the practice of zoning, whether it's school attendance zoning or whether it is residential zoning, we have propagated Jim Crow. And so, part of my work at Greensboro, I see in that spirit. And so I also want to make sure that I mention my family. So you see my family up here. This is, let's see. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to ruin this setup here. But so this is my wife, Dr. Sarah Coet. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Family Medicine at UNC School of Medicine. This is Moses and Isaiah. There are twins. They're going to be they're going to be a year old come March 26th. So so we got a little less than a month to go before they turn a year old. And of course, our oldest, Zara. She's getting towards 3 years old. Her birthday is in June. But I mean, these kids are really the apple of my eye. And I'm so lucky to be with Sarah. She's been so supportive. We've known each other now for the past 8 years. We met when I was in law school, but can you all hear me okay? Am I fading in and out? Okay. And so there's my family. We live right up the road, actually. If y'all are familiar with the Lake Forest neighborhood, it's right up the road from here, but we are thankful to have a home, a lovely home where we are able to raise our 3 beautiful children, and where we are looking forward to having them in our public school, just as I was in our schools. Other thing I didn't really cover, my time on the Chapel Hill Town Council. I won't talk about that for too long, but suffice to say, after my time working on Josh Stein's campaign, I was really disappointed with the turnout, especially among young people between ages 18 and 25. And it was, again, one of those situations where I was thinking, what can I do to help this situation? What can I do to engage more young people in with government? And, from my work in civil rights, especially on zoning issues, I thought about local government. I thought about the times that I had actually gone to town council meetings as a teenager, learning about the town, learning about how it interacts with the daily lives of people. And I thought, well, town council, I mean, this is the level of government that's closest to the people. This is where you can actually make the most impact, where you can see your town council members, your mayor, talk to them, influence decisions, much more than you can, say, US Senate, or even right now, the General Assembly. And so I decided back in the spring of 2017 to run for Chapel Hill Town Council, and was honored to be elected. And when I got onto the Chapel Hill Town Council, I didn't have a kind of broad sense of what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to apply an equity lens to everything that I did, every decision that I made. And I was proud to lead an initiative along with my council colleague Karen Stegman to create a first ever town-run criminal justice debt fund. Back in that summer of 2019, then Chief Justice Sherry Beasley had issued a call to everyone, regardless if you were in business, medicine, or government, a call to everyone to do something about the excessive court costs and fees that our court system levies on people. These fees, I mean, just to give an example, there's a fee associated with prosecution introducing evidence against the defendant. Defendant has to pay for that. For a failure to appear in court, doesn't matter what your excuse is, there's a fee or penalty for that. And it can range from $50 to $100. But think about poor folks, think about working class folks, folks who are struggling to put food on the table for their kids or for their families or for themselves. Think about what all they have to pay for: rent, utilities, they got to use a car to get from place to place, gas, all of those things. And on top of that, they have to pay these other costs and fees. And so about 500,000 North Carolinians, Chief Justice Beasley said at that point, are saddled with these excessive court costs and fees, and in many instances are preventing them from living the lives in which they want to live, in which they are providing for their families and for themselves. And so, Karen and I, we put our heads together and, found that Chapel Hill was an unwitting participant in this system, because the town essentially collects $20,000 to $25,000 each year of rent off of a building right on the corner of Franklin Street, across from where Silent Sam used to be. It's partly used as a courthouse building, partly used as a post office. But essentially, we found that because court system is using that building, they pay the town Chapel Hill $20,000 to $25,000 for use of that building. And so we thought, well, why don't we convert that money for a fund that goes towards helping folks who are saddled with these excessive court costs and fees. And initially, when we brought that idea up, faced quite a bit of resistance. But over the next 7 months, we went about the work of talking with stakeholders, talking with advocates, talking with law enforcement, even talking with judges. And we were able to get support from all of these groups. And we came back to the council and we passed it unanimously about 7 months later. It was really proud of that work because, in a town like Chapel Hill, you would think that, everyone is of the same minds that, of course, no brainer, we got to help people. But even in a town like Chapel Hill, we still struggle to see where we need equity and where we need to do the work of re-examining the things that we've done for so long. And so, again, I won't talk long about my time on the council, except to say that that was a real opportunity for me to examine closely the work that we were doing, long-time practices, long-time things that we'd done, and to apply an equity lens so that we could do things differently and address the equity that we all talk about and want to do something about. Let's see. So I do want to talk about some of the other challenges that we face here in our community and in North Carolina. Public education is one that's well documented, but essentially we are still dealing with a lack of commitment, full commitment to Leandro, where we continue to have schools across the state. Now, I've seen this up close and personal. I've represented client communities where their children are in schools that are deteriorating, where ceilings are falling in on students as instruction is going on, especially in places like Halifax County, Duplin County, places where we continue to see segregation being propagated, not legally, of course, but through the practice of residential zoning, through the practice of school attendance zoning. We are continuing to see schools across our state having inequitable distribution of resources. And so I think the last figure that I heard, the Public Schools Forum, they had announced a couple of months ago that we are still $12 billion in the hole in needed repairs of schools across the state. And so we need to rectify that, but that is part of the state of our education. My auntie Angie, she is a teacher at Sewell Elementary. And even in a place like Chapel Hill, she tells me about the work still to be done here. I mean, of course, there's the issue of teacher pay, which also needs to be rectified, but there's also the dangers that we're seeing in parents who have identified critical race theory as something that they think is being taught in our schools. The reality is that it is not being taught in our schools. But what we are seeing is a reorientation of some schools towards trying to teach a truer narrative of our history, and that has come under attack. My aunt has seen it. A friend of mine who I grew up with, Eugenia Floyd, Ms. Floyd, who was named State Teacher of the Year. She actually teaches at Mary Scroggs Elementary here in Chapel Hill. She's also told me about the kinds of attacks that teachers are coming under for this perception that they're teaching about racism. I mean, my view, of course, is that we should be teaching about racism. I mean, this is the kind of work that is work that Dr. King was committed to. It's the kind of work that will really move the needle in terms of raising generations who will be not only aware of racism, but will be active agents for change to eradicate racism. And so we have these ongoing challenges to the teaching profession, which we are seeing a lot of otherwise very qualified people either leave the profession or just not enter it. Right now, our North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program, which is a program designed to build a pipeline of teachers, it has very few slots available at this point, about 200 slots per year for folks who have an interest in teaching. There's a real need to expand that, to support teachers, to make sure that they've got the resources that they need, especially in more rural parts of our state, poorer parts of our state. And then, of course, higher education. One thing that I bore witness to at the UNC Center for Civil Rights was the Board of Governors targeting the Center for Civil Rights, targeting the Poverty Center that Gene Nickel was the director of. And in the case of the Poverty Center, eliminating it entirely. And in the case of the Center for Civil Rights, taking away its ability to litigate, taking away its ability to help people. And there's been such an influx of partisanship on the UNC Board of Governors, and we really need to take some measures to take the politics out of it, to make sure that we are being intentional about not having folks on there who are partisans, for example, not having former lawmakers or registered lobbyists on a Board of Governors, but really, more importantly, allowing the university to do what it does best: hire faculty, take care of its students, look after students' interests, and right now we're just not seeing that. In terms of the environment and climate justice, part of my work also at the Center for Civil Rights was also advocating for environmental justice. For those that don't know, my mother was actually a founding member of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And I can remember as a kid, she would take me out to Eastern North Carolina, especially to the Franklinton Center. And I remember, playing around a lot, but also remember talking with people who were impacted by the siting of landfills right next to their communities, people who were influenced by hog farms, which spewed waste and emissions, beyond what the regulations of North Carolina allow. And it was the first time in my life that I'd really seen what community organizing looks like up close and personal. I saw the strength in people against long odds, against an industry that has lots of highly paid lawyers and lots of highly paid lobbyists, but they, in their hearts, of course, knew what was wrong. They saw it up close and personal, and they dedicated their lives to the struggle to rectify those wrongs. And so that was also inspiring for me, but what that also meant for my civil rights work was that I also wanted to do my best to help. And so, in the course of my work, I got to do some really interesting work, especially involving the Department of Environmental Quality and getting them to update some standards. We weren't able to get them to do it all the way, and we still have a lot of work to do in terms of updating their emission standards. And certainly enforcement is lacking at this point because of the cuts that we've seen to Department of Environmental Quality. But I mean, that work also kind of had me have a front row seat to what climate change looks like, especially for poor folks, for Black and brown folks, especially in Eastern North Carolina. And then healthcare. I was fortunate enough, this was just a few months after I graduated from law school, to be invited to watch a trial that was happening in a town called Belhaven, North Carolina. And the interesting thing about this particular trial was that it involved a challenge to Vidant, a healthcare provider. Vidant essentially, they ran a hospital that was they were gonna be closing down their hospital. And Belhaven is a very small town. It's in a very rural part of North Carolina. And closing down that hospital also meant that folks were gonna be without care. And they'd have to drive hundreds of miles to go get care without that hospital. And so in an interesting challenge, this was Reverend Barber, when he was president of the North Carolina NAACP. The North Carolina NAACP joined with the mayor of Belhaven, who was Republican, in a suit to try to keep this rural hospital open, and had the great fortune and honor of sitting next to Reverend Barber during that trial, and just seeing up close and personal how much this issue matters, not just to Democrats, but to Republicans too. And of course, we know all too well about North Carolina's lack of commitment, especially when it comes to Medicaid expansion. But I mean, real people are hurting. People are dying. Hospitals are closing. And for us to not take advantage of this opportunity to slow, if not stop all of that, we continue to just go down this road. And a lot of folks don't understand why. I mean, there's big money at play, but that's certainly part of the state of things when it comes to North Carolina and our access to healthcare. I could be very brief about this slide. What has the legislature done about this? Not very much. I mean, I will say that in this past year's budget that was signed by the governor, there is a measure in there about essentially an exploratory study of Medicaid expansion. One hopes that will lead to actual expansion, but time will tell. But there's certainly been a lot of legislation that's been passed that has undermined all of these issues. Not to mention our attacks on our democracy with the voter photo ID law that was passed back in 2013. That not only addressed voter photo ID, but also undercut early voting and enacted measures to challenge folks' ballot without them even knowing. But all that said, one of the primary jobs of the legislature is not only to enact legislation or to repeal legislation, but it's also funding. Oftentimes, and I learned this very well being on the town council, but your government budget is a reflection of your priorities and your values. And when we've had budgets that have consistently cut public education or have diverted public education dollars to school vouchers to private schools, that says something about what your legislature values. When you have a legislature that removes funding from your Department of Environmental Quality, that says something about your legislature's orientation towards climate change. When you have legislation that essentially maintains funding to a Department of Transportation that continues to have this kind of car-centric approach, that also says something about your legislature's attitude. And so, part of my work, that I see as a candidate is not just talking about myself, but it's really talking to young people. Again, for me, it comes back to young people, talking to young people about why this stuff matters to them, why it matters to them to have a state legislature that is willing to fund the kinds of things that they want to see, that is willing to make sure that they have their right to vote. And that's just, to me, the most important part of the work is connecting with their young people, engaging with their young people, and ultimately getting them to the polls so that they can be active participants in our democracy. So what more can we do? So I'm in this room with folks who, and I'm going to make an assumption here, who are also agents of change, or at the very least want to see change. And so, the kind of classic things I know that y'all have heard over the past decade plus is, we need to, get a certain party, in the legislature. We need to fundraise, raise money for that side of the ticket. I have I do believe in those things, but I also want to make sure that certain things don't go unnoticed. So voting, particularly in our judicial elections, I mean, as a lawyer, I've certainly seen the power of the courts. We all have seen it, really, especially the United States Supreme Court, but particularly our courts in North Carolina. I mean, right now, in the state Supreme Court, we've got a Supreme Court that thankfully has taken a really critical eye when it comes to gerrymandering in North Carolina. But these folks are elected. They're not like judges that we see in federal district courts or federal circuit courts or the United States Supreme Court. They don't have lifetime appointments. They have to run and get elected and get reelected. And so I want folks to just make sure to keep in mind on that ballot that, on the long ballot that you get, make sure you are going right down the ballot through the judicial candidates, because, ultimately these maps that we got, I mean, these maps, they'd be signed, sealed, and delivered if it had not been for the composition of our current Supreme Court. And so I just encourage everyone to make sure that not only are you going down the ballot completing it, but also that you're telling your friends, your neighbors, and if you know folks, especially in rural districts, tell them too. I can remember, Mike Morgan, when he won back in 2016, a Black man. It was amazing to see that he won. And I can remember talking to some Republican voters, and they're like, "Yeah, Mike Morgan, that sounds like a strong name." They didn't know they didn't know who he was. But again, the importance of being informed, the importance of going down the ballot. I mean, it makes a difference for candidates like Mike Morgan, who won a statewide office at a time when this state went towards Trump. The other thing I'll say too is, change the legislature and supporting candidates. I'd say particularly in rural districts, because even though you may not see a particular candidate win, it's important to lay the foundation for change in that district. I know among folks, especially my generation and younger, we tend to want to see results now. We want to see change right now, and that should always be the goal, of course. But the reality is that sometimes change is a bit slower, but it takes intention. It takes being intentional about laying a foundation, supporting people, building a pipeline. You're not going to see the results right away, but it's important to support people all the same, so that you may not see a particular candidate in a rural district win, but what you could see is that candidate be effective in spreading their message. Maybe they make a strong showing in that election, and that sets them up or another candidate up for success in the future. And then the third one, of course, is to speak out. Even though speaking out is like right now speaking against a wall, it's still important that history recognize that there are people who are upset about what's going on, that there are people who are not willing to be silent. I don't remember the exact quote from Dr. King, but something he said that was really important is that the moment that you go silent, this is not verbatim, but the moment you go silent, that's when injustice really thrives. And so I'll just encourage you all, in whatever way you can, speak out. Continue to identify and speak out against the injustice that you see. With all that, I will open it up for questions. Oh, absolutely. Okay, great. I know there's a particular way, yeah.
You can hold on to the mic.
Okay, all right.
We're going to go into a question and answer session. I'm going to walk around with this. Oh, you have the stick. Okay. Chris has the magic wand.
Oh, I'll let her know. She's doing well. She's doing well. Yeah, she's yeah. No worries. No, she's actually sorry. Cut this off.
Hold that with the microphone.
That's fine.
And that's just the Zoom, so.
All right, question, anyone have any? All right. You could speak up.
I can. I do that very well. Alan, so long as local school districts are funded based on their property tax base, how are we ever going to get equality in education in America?
Yep, excellent question. So, one particular case I was a part of involved a challenge to Halifax County Board of Commissioners. Essentially, we were challenging the idea that the obligation to provide a sound basic education only falls with the state. We were challenging that because, really the way the court had interpreted it was that county boards of commissioners, who are also responsible for funding public education, they have an obligation too. Unfortunately, we lost on that. We didn't quite get past a basic procedural motion because there's such a kind of locked in view on the state. But you're right to point out the fact that our public schools are also funded through property taxes, and districts like Chapel Hill, Carborough, districts like Mecklenburg, Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, even Durham schools, they see higher property tax, they see higher property tax value or revenue, and they're able to fund their programs and teachers accordingly. I would love to see us reshift that kind of funding model. I know that there was a committee in response to Leandro that was formed by the governor a couple of years ago that strongly recommended that we actually target state funding in a way that it is going towards poor school districts and funding them at the same levels that we see school systems like Chapel Hill, Carborough, and others are. So, I'd love to be part of changing that so that we are more equitable in the way that we fund schools. Have the state make up a portion of that so that every school system is being funded at the same levels.
We have to have this one switched on.
I do, yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next, anyone else? Any other?
Well, you hit all the targets on my list. The K through 12 and the critical race theory, especially the healthcare expansion of Medicaid. I've been in the healthcare sector, and it is amazing to me that more hospitals haven't gone out of business. And I think this is the final impetus for expansion of Medicaid. Is there's now a group of hospitals around the state who are telling legislators in Raleigh that they will go out of business unless Medicaid is expanded. And that will hurt a lot of people in their pocketbooks, not just poor people
Yes,
who have been mainly hurt till now.
right.
So I'm happy to see that coming. I mean, I have my fingers crossed.
Yes.
But
Yep.
your comment about putting money into the transportation sector. I went to Wilmington a couple of weeks ago. The amount of infrastructure dollars that are going into road building to the east of Raleigh
Yep.
is in the millions, if not billions. It is
Right.
pretty amazing.
Right.
The investment going in there to move cars
Right.
into Raleigh and around Raleigh, where the rest of the state is suffering.
Thank you for pointing that out.
And I'm assuming
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, one thing in particular that comes to mind first is, I mean, back in 2013, the General Assembly made a change to the way that we fund bike and pedestrian projects. Whereas before, the state would fund separate standalone bike and pedestrian projects, it now does not. It has to be a project that is associated with a road project. I mean, that's just a basic change we can make, but there's so much more to do to support public transit, support people getting out of their cars. I appreciate you bringing that up. Oh, yes, ma'am.
You spoke in your talk about the work in Chapel Hill to reduce the fines and other costs to
Yes.
people who were arrested. Is there any other aspect of criminal justice at the local level that we might get involved in or
Yes.
be of service to?
Absolutely. So there's the Orange County, I believe it's called the Bail Bond Projects. Essentially a project to help out folks who have been arrested, but who, if they can't kind of put up requisite money or property for a bond, they have to sit in jail. This is before the person even gets tried, even before they get proven innocent or guilty, they've got to sit in jail. And so that's an excellent project that's been going on that has been trying to find funding for folks so that they can not have to sit in jail. Other kinds of local ways, we've got our Orange County Criminal Justice Resource Department, which is actually doing some great work when it comes to expungements. There's such a backlog right now because we don't have very many state resources, but the expungement of records is a consistent problem in which we have a lot of folks who have actually gotten cleared, or they've gotten certain offenses off their record, but they have to then go back to court to get it actually done. And so the Orange County Criminal Justice Resource Department helps out a lot. I wish I had their number on me, but if you email me or call me, I'm happy to put you in touch with their director. And she's definitely got ways to plug people right into that work. There's also in our county a diversion program, especially for juveniles, that tries to steer them away from arrests or getting incarcerated otherwise. And I know that our director, again, the same department, Criminal Justice Resource Department, she's got great ways to plug people into that work too. Her name is Kate Finhagen. I don't know if folks are familiar with her, but she's the first director of our Orange County Criminal Justice Department. She, in the past, was a public defender. Just a trailblazer in many ways. And so if we can connect right after this, or you can email me, call me, I can put you in touch with some of those ways that you can help.
Thanks for.
Absolutely.
I have a question.
Zoom attendees wants to ask a question. We're going to try doing this audio wise because we don't. So we'll see how this works. Linda, I'm going to turn up the volume of my computer. So go ahead and ask your question and see what happens.
Okay, I hope, is my voice clear? Because
Nothing's happened. Hold on here.
Hold on, Linda.
Okay.
That's right. Select the speaker. Let me try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Wonderful.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, good. Okay. So I love the idea of changing big institutions or getting them to change their rules. But I always feel like these institutions are made up of individuals and who have attitudes, and I feel like their attitudes have to be changed.
Yes.
And I have always felt like it's a matter of getting people of color together with white people to get to know each other.
Mhm.
And I've seen examples of that. I lived in Boston for about 40 years and had no idea we had a racist problem up there
Mhm.
until we came down here. And, I went back to Boston and told my friends, oh my gosh, Black people talk to us, because that had never happened in Boston.
Mhm.
And I was part of a Quaker meeting up there, and every time I go back to visit and I sit with them, I hear them talking about racism. They're very concerned about racism and what are they going to do about it? And I keep thinking, you need to get out and talk to some people of color. You need to,
Yep.
make them your neighbors, make them
Right.
do projects with them. And I just don't know
Right.
how we can do this, because people gravitate towards people they're comfortable with. And also, because of our racist society, we haven't allowed much mixing, by keeping Black people down. And I don't know, I'm wondering if you have any insights into this.
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent point that you bring up. It takes me back to when I was actually in college, and I had a classmate reach out to me because she was a young white woman. She was interested in going to a Black church. And I said, great, you should go. And she said, well, but I don't feel the most comfortable going by myself. Can you go with me? And, one of my issues at the time was that, one, I was in college, so I couldn't just kind of fly down and accompany her to a church. But then two, Black folks and really people of color in the United States, I mean, they are always in white spaces, in predominantly white spaces. It's not a matter of preference. It's just, it is what it is. But when it's flipped, it doesn't work that same way. A lot of white folks don't have to go into a Black church. They don't have to go into Black spaces. And so I encouraged my friend at the time. I said, listen, you really should just go by yourself, because whatever kind of reluctance or hesitancy that you're having, you'll find that when you're in that space, it's going to be one of the most welcoming spaces you have ever been in. And in the end, she decided not to go by herself, but I would challenge every white person. I mean, whether it is a church or whether it is a community center, or whether it's just walking around in the parts of town that Black folks, Latinx, other folks of color are, go ahead and do it. Just treat the space like you would your own space, with respect, with dignity, and yeah, that's kind of the first thing that I would suggest to try to change that. And certainly, in terms of public spaces that we have in our town, in our communities, we want to make sure that those are as welcoming as they can possibly be. So, if there are events that you're going to be a part of, events that you're doing, make sure that you are inviting your friends of color along with you. I can remember, especially my campaigning work, I got to know someone who, white person, and she asked me, how do I get more Black folks, more people of color, like into this work of campaigning. Like how can I help out with that? And one thing I said to her was, the thing about these kinds of spaces and really other kinds of professional spaces where networking is so important. Networking is about relationships, the people you know. Do everything you can to reach outside of your immediate network and to reach out to Black folks, reach back to the university, reach back out to Black student movement. That's one of the largest Black student groups at UNC. Reach out to the Asian American Center. Go into these spaces yourself and talk to folks about the importance of having them in the profession. That's when we're going to see the needle, when we have folks willing to step outside their comfort zones, go into these other spaces and make a genuine effort to connect with folks. I think that's when we'll see the needle moved. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. In this morning's News and Observer, they published the latest version of the new redistricting maps. And I guess this is the third version now. Do you feel, if you've had a chance to look at it, that this is maybe finally an acceptable version of something that will help our gerrymandering problem?
Great question. So to your first question, I have not actually looked at those maps yet. Was busy with the kids this morning. But so let me ask the question right back to you. So are these congressional maps, do you know, or are these maps for both state house states? Okay, gotcha. Well, without even looking at the maps, I can guess where this is going to go. But I mean, I can't really give you an informed answer because I haven't looked at the map yet. So I'm not sure. I could guess, but I don't want to do that. And I mean, I'd love for us to keep in touch. If you could, call me or email me, would love to follow up with you about that because I do want to answer your question. Thank you.
I have a question, but I have a comment too about the easy way to find places where Black people are. It's just you can just Google it now. It's not as far off as it used to be. There's a festival every year called Black August in the Park. You just want to be immersed in Black culture, just go. NCCU has an art museum in it, and there's lots of things to do on campus all the time. So I just say to people, just get out there and get involved.
Yes.
But my question is, earlier you had talked about being disappointed in the youth turnout. I guess this is like young millennials, Gen Z turnout in voting. Have you done anything or have any thoughts on why there may not have been as much turnout, or things that have worked or have not worked to get them to turn out more?
Right. Thank you. That's an excellent question. The question about how to turn out the young people. What have I done? What can be done to improve that? So one of the things that I pledged to do when I ran for council was that within 45 days to take office, I would put together a committee of folks who represent a cross-section of Chapel Hill to put together a program that is specifically designed to engage young people and other people of color with government. And so got together maybe a committee of about 10 people. We had UNC students, high school students. We had folks from the north side of town. Folks are familiar with north side of Chapel Hill. It's a predominantly Black area of town. We had elderly people in there as well. And they were all wonderful. Over 6 months, this was from about January of 2018 to June 2018. We met 6 or 7 times, and we came up with a really comprehensive program for essentially the purpose of it was to, one, educate about what government does, especially local government, but then two, how to get involved, especially as a member of an advisory board and running for office. And so we held our first program. This was back in September of 2018. We had an initial cohort of about 13 people. I'd say about 9 of the 13 were 25 and younger. I remember one of the members, both of the committee and of the program itself, Tai Nguyen, he's a current town council member, but he took part in that program. We had a couple other folks who went on to serve on an advisory board, but essentially, I think for a lot of young people, and this was brought out during the course of that program, it was about demystifying what government does. So, and we hear about government, government, we hear about police, we hear about, what Congress does, but don't know much about what local government actually does. And so it was a really neat program, really neat way for us to kind of get into the weeds about how the Chapel Hill Town Council, how the Orange County Board of County Commissioners affects your everyday life, affects your housing, affects your roads, affects flooding issues. That program, it's since been expanded. It's actually now housed under the IFC, the Interfaith Council. It's out of my hands now. I hand it off to someone else, but they're doing some really great work in kind of bringing in other components of it, where not only are they talking about government, but they're talking about ways that you can affect change in government to get more of the things that poor folks need. And so I say that all to say that, moving forward and thinking about how we can amplify that kind of work, I see a lot of potential in our school systems, in our schools, the way that we teach. I mean, I remember when I was coming up through school, I learned about North Carolina state history. I learned about Congress, learned about the president, learned about the checks and balances, the three branches, but never actually had a lesson on how North Carolina government works, much less on how town and county governments work. And if we are as intentional about teaching, math, geometry, algebra in school, we really ought to have not just one course, but several courses devoted to civic education. Even in the legislature, you can be a bit limited in what you can do, but certainly, I would love for our State Board of Education to focus more on that part of things. How do we demystify government and how it works in everyday lives, and empower our young people with that knowledge so that they then can see the power that their vote can have, why their vote matters. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, for that
Thank you.
wonderful presentation. Announcements? Are there any announcements? For next week's speaker, do we know?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I guess we do opening words.
okay, so now he's going to decamp.
Yeah, I'll be doing a travel log on my trip to Antarctica. I'm obviously not an expert on anything about Antarctica, except for the fact that I was just there for a few days. But I have lots of nice pictures of penguins and seals, and I'll tell you anything I can think of that I learned.
No ice? All right, any other announcements? If not, then Chris has his closing words.
I'm just going to be brief here. I was going to project this, but technology sometimes just gives me a headache. So I'm just going to read this to you. I found that Facebook is a great source of not just doom stuff, but funny stuff as well as inspiration. Here's one of them. Equal rights for others does not mean less rights for you. It's not a pie. And then the next one. We should measure the prosperity of a nation not by the number of millionaires, but by the absence of poverty, the prevalence of health, the efficiency of public schools, and the number of people who can and do read worthwhile books. And that is by W.E.B. Du Bois.
Thank you, Chris. Our program has ended, but our fellowship continues. So please join us next Sunday for Gretchen's travelogue. Take care. Bye.